Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in today. My name is Alexis Dixon. I'm a business and family mediator, and my show is called Interiors. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to quite an extraordinary mind, an extraordinary human being. His name is Dr. Gentry Patrick, and so let me introduce you to him. Dr. Gentry Patrick is a professor in the Neurobiology Section of the Division of Biological Sciences at the University of California, San Diego. His lab studies the role of protein turnover in synaptic plasticity and neurodegenerative diseases. He additionally is the director of Mentorship and Diversity for the Division of Biological Sciences and is the associate director of Neurosciences Graduate Program at UC San Diego. Dr. Patrick was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, where he attended King Drew Medical Magnet High School in Watts, California. Dr. Patrick received his PhD from Harvard University in 1999 after working in the lab of Dr. Tsai.
Yes.
Dr. Tsai, I got that correctly. He was a Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation and a United Negro College Fund postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Erin Schuman at the California Institute of Technology. Dr. Patrick joined UCSD faculty in 2004. Dr. Patrick is dedicated to driving the overall vision for the PATHS program as a pilot program model for institutional transformation and improved success of underserved students in STEM. Welcome, Dr. Patrick.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, let's just go right into it. How has COVID influenced your research? First of all, tell us about your research and how COVID has influenced it.
Yeah, so I'm a neuroscientist. You can call me a cell biologist. I just so happen to work in neurons, specifically in the CNS, work with rodent models. And I'm very interested in understanding something that's very central to the central dogma, if you will. For instance, we know that DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein, right? And it just so happens that RNA and protein, in many cases, are turned over, meaning they don't live forever. You know, the DNA is the genetic blueprint, RNA and proteins will be turned over. And I'm very interested in understanding what's the signals that control how long proteins live and when they're degraded, under what cues are driving their degradation. And in many cases, this is happening in disease states where altered protein turnover causes disease pathogenesis, like in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or Huntington's disease. So my lab is very interested in proteins that are being made and then proteins that are being turned over, specifically at the synapse, and the machinery that controls the turnover of particular types of proteins. In particular, my lab studies glutamate receptors. Glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in our brains, and that's why we're having a conversation right now. It just so happens that as it's released from one cell onto another from the presynaptic terminal and floats across and actually binds glutamate receptors, particular types, one of them being AMPA type glutamate receptors. I study basically the day in the life of an AMPA receptor, meaning how it's made, how it gets back to the synapse, when it's removed, and specifically the cues that remove it, and the degradation pathway that I study that's also altered in disease is also this interesting pathway that controls the number of these glutamate receptors through a degradation pathway.
Interesting. Now, does this require some interdisciplinary collaboration, or is this onto itself?
Yeah, so I started off as a biochemist. You know, I was working in the lab running gels, and then I got interested in certain aspects of cell biology, and then I made my way to neurons. So I use a pretty interdisciplinary approach to do the work that we do in the lab. It's very much cell biology-esque and based. So in some cases, I'm collaborating with others, right? Those that are hardcore electrophysiologists or systems biologists, really to understand kind of mapping the biochemical pathways that we study, as well as the molecules that we study, and kind of thinking about how they play a role in the intact animal with regards to whether it be physiological studies or behavior studies, the role that it plays in a variety of disorders, or just understanding the pathogenesis that takes place in disease pathways such as Alzheimer's disease, something that we're very interested in.
Well, I'm listening to your tonality as you speak about this. I'm reading your face as you speak about this. And there's a passion that you bring to this. I can see you really love what you do.
Yeah, I'm a nerd. You know, I like science. I like proteins. I like protein turnover. And what's interesting about, you know, what I do is that I get to do it with others, right? And so it's exciting to be able to not do something in isolation. You know, having a lab, you know, I never thought I would have a lab, but here I am. I'm 16 years in, have a lab. I've had several graduate students, and we've been working on this problem together. And then when I go out and give talks about our work, people sit and they're interested, and there's discourse and a level of engagement. And I'm like, wow, I'm bringing something to the table. And it's from my own little, you know, slice of, or the realm of the science that I do, whether no matter how small or big you may think that is, it's something that I've contributed to, and that new knowledge, and I think about all the time. So I think that's what's drew me in, this idea of like new knowledge, and I was contributing to that. Especially when I think of the dichotomy, or the from where I came from as a young kid to where I am now, talking about new knowledge in the realm of synapse and synapse function, right?
Yeah, so you know, because I know you're from Sun Central. One of the things that's very interesting, being a nerd, the stereotypical perception would be, how does a kid from Watts find this, you know, this very organic passion about science and synapses? Can you talk about that? Because, you know, oftentimes when we hear of South Central or Watts, we don't usually equate that to kids being excited about science, right? We have a kind of a singular narrative about those kinds of environments. So can you talk what was in the soil and the air and the texture of your upbringing that kind of cultivated this in you?
Well, first thing that came to my mind was the following. When I'm joking and maybe sitting around at a meeting, talking with colleagues, typically that don't look like me, from all over the world or the country, I say, well, you guys have a lot of book smarts, but you know what I have street smarts. So yeah, I grew up on the streets of South Central LA, and you know, having the ability to persist and navigate in spite of, without even knowing what you're really up against. You know that thing, you know, whether it's dangerous because of a lack of education and drugs and gangs, but you just kind of navigate that space, and you find your way. And so when I walked into science, it was, here's something new. I'm a guy that likes new things. I'm interested, I could be interested in science. I didn't know that I could be a neuroscientist. I didn't even know what one was, right? Growing up. My mom had me at a very young age of 16, and I, you know, didn't have any role models of doctors and scientists in my family, right? But I found this little bit of, the door was cracked open a little bit, and I peeked in and kind of found this passion that actually had to keep growing. It wasn't a step function. It wasn't where I saw it and now realized that's what I'm going to do. I had to kind of sit with it and grow with it and understand my self-identity within it. And so for me, the entire trajectory, it's not just one instance in time. I look back over an entirety of my life up to this point now, and every moment has meant something. Every serendipitous moment, every piece of luck, every conversation, I know every person that I've met, in many cases, has contributed to some aspect of where I'm trying to go in the work that I'm doing, which I think for me, when I think about my interest in neuroscience and my interest in social justice, they're not disparate. They sit on the same page.
Can you talk about that? I mean, you just said so many things there. First of all, I want when you talk about, you didn't use the word grit, but you talked about your, was it resiliency that you talked about?
Persistence, or in spite
Yeah,
of, right?
yeah, in spite
But I would
of,
say grit. Yeah, absolutely. So,
yeah.
you know, when I've spoken to students, when I speak, whether it's, in a keynote or speaking at a school, keynote in a large format, speaking at a school, maybe even to a small group of students, I bring that same level of passion, because for me, this opportunity was not about getting out of the inner city. In fact, it's quite serendipitous, and importantly, it's bringing me back to the inner city. I would say that there were other kids that were just like me. They just, the system is not built to value the talent and intellect from these amazing communities that are marginalized, that are beaten down, that don't get to fixate in space and time of a place something better, of a something that maybe does a little bit more for their family, as opposed to just kind of dealing with the day-to-day grind. And it really does kind of blur over, and then you look back and it's like, okay, I'm 65 years old now, or whatever. And when you just as anecdotally for someone to think about their life retrospectively. But what if we allowed for creativity and for interest and the sheer ability of a community collectively, represented maybe in one student at a time, one kid at a time? I've been called an anomaly. And I tell individuals when they call me, when they've said that to me to my face, I said, I'm not an anomaly. Mm-hmm. What I am is an indication of something that a person that has negotiated a variety of things and it has landed on where I am now. But it's because of things like access, advocacy, things that we can actually quantify, right? Advocacy and mentorship, things that we know have worked in many cases for lots of other groups of people here in this country and around the world. And it should be we shouldn't have to wonder if those things aren't available to other groups, such as marginalized groups, Black and brown individuals, for instance. We should not wonder why, they don't find their way into these pathways. Where they are, breaking away from the wealth disparity or the health disparities, right? For instance, if Black Lives Matter, then we need more Black doctors. We need more Black scientists that find that interest and passion and curiosity and tying it back to their community. Right? That's why, for me, again, the social justice, the neuroscience, they all come together.
I'm just listening to you speak, and it's interesting how pervasive your passion is. You speak about your your work in your lab, and I hear this passion, and you speak about this, that you're not an anomaly, and there's so many more like you, and you bring a passion to that human aspect of it. I know one of the things you've done in your life, in addition to being a scientist, is that you started a PATHS program at UCSD. Can you talk a bit about that and why you started it and where the program is today?
Right. I want to start with something that is really not a part of the components of the pathway of the program. It's called Pathways to STEM through Enhanced Access and Mentorship, PATH Scholars Program. But I want to talk about where I was 5 years ago that drew me down this path. I was actually feeling very lost and very disconnected from not necessarily my science, but the world that I lived in and why science should matter in my life and the world that I know to be and value, as opposed to being a warrior into other worlds. You know, I wanted the world that I know, my family, my community, the communities that I come from, to understand the importance of not only the work that I do, but how that can also be something that drives change in their lives, especially since it's linked to science and health, right? It's kind of an obvious thing where I think, you know, there's a reason why a lot of high achieving kids want to do, they want to go into medicine, for instance, because they know that they can help their community one day. So I was sitting in this space, you know, 2015, 16, and I wanted to do something different. UCSD is not very diverse. And while I, you know, love teaching, I'm very passionate, I love teaching, standing up there, I also wanted to see more individuals that looked like me sitting in those seats. If I'm teaching a class of 300, there'll be very few Black and brown individuals there. And it became a little bit depressing to consider that my life's work would be doing my science and not being able to somehow connect that back to somehow impacting the community that I come from. And on a day-to-day, my job is really to train and teach individuals that worked hard to get there, but don't represent anything that look like me or come from my community. And that got a little depressing. So I decided that I would try to figure out what was it that allowed me to succeed, and take all that secret sauce, first of all, define it, understand it. People have been studying the pipeline for quite a long time. And to this day, you might find several people who might say that that pipeline is very narrowed because it's clogged up or in fact broken. But I would say that the pipeline can work if you infuse things like self-identity, empathy, compassion, trust, acknowledgement of fear and of the unknown, but allowing these students to forge ahead in spite of, with a team around them. So, I actually used to tell philanthropy, hey, think of nepotism. We want to build a program that almost rivals nepotism. These kids don't have anything. What if we gave them everything? Do you think that they would succeed? And that's actually quite an interesting way to pose it. It's quickly in someone's mind, they're like, you're right. If we give them X, Y, and Z, this likelihood of their success would be, I might make a guesstimation that they might do well. And indeed, that is the case. Indeed, these students not only buy into the fact of their own humanity, their own interest in STEM, their STEM identity, empathy for themselves as they're negotiating something that's quite different than where they've come from. And not many people on the path with them doing it also. But they found a family in this program. We provide so many different things. And what was very interesting was I didn't look to the campus to figure out how to do this. I just walked right into the community. I said, who can be my partners? I found local philanthropists, and philanthropic entities, local nonprofits. And I would say, hey, what are you doing and how can I help? In many cases, it was just showing up to the table and lending my voice, saying that, oh, well, I'm adding to the math problem here, and I see that we can solve it by maybe looking at it this way also. And for me, it was also listening and learning, right? Being very prescriptive. I think academia as an institution of higher learning, we come in and we don't bring much wisdom and for that matter, empathy to the problems that we want to solve with regards to the STEM pipeline, and for that matter, a social justice issue when we think about today's world.
Can you talk about the role? It's interesting as a scientist, when you listen to scientists, I don't normally hear the word wisdom and empathy used within the scientific sector, right? It's very much an academic, very precise, very, right, quantifiable. mathematical kind of engagement with it, right? I have to do this, I have an hypothesis, I prove it, and then it's a very linear kind of engagement. And there is a reason for that, right? Science has to be founded on fact, and it has to be provable and repeatable. And so I'm not poo-pooing that in any way at all. And then you bring in the intersection of the scientific modality in respect to empathy and wisdom. And can you talk about the intersection of wisdom and empathy in the role of the scientific realm?
So for me, this is a very interesting space to be sitting in right now, and understanding that the world is challenging. Science is on the ropes to some degree when I look at it from a high level, when I see, you know, that where facts not really mattering as much from a political standpoint. And if that's the case, then we're really not thinking about justice for all. We're really thinking about me and my political interest, or my interest in realm A or B. While a lot of people would like to think, you know, math and science is just this pure thing. You can study it and you can, you know, observe it, and then it can reveal itself. But there's a huge human component to our ability to do science, our ability to engage it, our ability to include others. You know, when we think about historically, subjects in science, typically white male, you know, there's differences in across the spectrum of our humanity, and without including individuals from all those communities, then we forget about, you know, diseases that preferentially or more readily affect other groups for a variety of reasons that we still don't know, or maybe some of the things that we know, right? Genetic components, environmental components. And if we don't include them, for instance, in the work, we're assuming that there's a high degree of empathy in all of these scientists and their scientific endeavors. But we know that that's not true, because most people are in their own space doing their science, and it's kind of a self-reflection, in many cases an external evaluation that's been pre-created, made a long time ago. We're not, you know, the way we evaluate and value things needs to evolve just as much as the science that we do. And for me right now, it really is a sense of wisdom. How are we using our wisdom to better bring empathy and therefore social justice to pathways in STEM for all? If we need diversity, we need all groups to be involved in the science that we do, to make sure that we're bringing the best and the brightest, but not only the best and the brightest, we're bringing the experience and the context and the communities. These individuals become conduits to their own communities, right? And so I see this really as, again, you know, my scientific endeavors, my scientific interests, they go hand in hand with my interest in social justice or diversity or empathy, for that matter.
You know, as I listen to you talk, the word investment comes to mind. You know, we invest in science, but also when we invest, there was a guy named Richard Florida who wrote a book called The Rise of the Creative Class. And essentially creativity becomes the new platform through which all future innovations will come from. And the idea of exclusivity versus inclusivity, I think really hijacks our creative force in order to solve the world's problem, right? It's almost as if creativity can come from anywhere. So the notion of excluding people from the process becomes antithetical to our investigation into how do we live better lives, right? Because we have no idea where the next creative thought is going to come from. So it sounds like an investment, not only in the scientific work, but who comes and then brings this fresh perceptions to the scientific work that's before us. Am I saying that correctly?
Absolutely. I think, what came to me when you were speaking was the fact that without this creativity and this inclusivity from across all groups, you have what's very clear in my mind, what's happening today, a social justice issue, if you will, if I can bring that back, public health crisis, if you will, because without that creativity, without that inclusivity, the issues of the day are plain in sight. Even for those that don't want to recognize them, they are plain in sight, right? And it's just a matter of the galvanizing enough of the right individuals in the right time and space to say, okay, we're no longer not going to see the real issues here, and we're gonna work to really solve this. And in part, we know we need to, for instance, in my case, what I'm very interested in, build a pipeline that really works, full of empathy, a social justice, a public health issue, right?
You know, you've mentioned social justice quite a bit in respect to the scientific world. Can you talk about that in some granularity in respect to what you're seeing, not only perhaps as the pipeline being stuck or stymied, but what can be done about it? How do you fix this through a social justice lens?
Well, the first, I think one word we haven't brought up is racial justice or racial injustice. Right. That's why I bring this up. To me, with what happened with the death of, the individuals this year, Breonna Taylor, blanking on his last name right now, George Floyd, and then what's continuously happened, I think. The scientists like myself, Black and brown scientists, we are the individuals that have pushed and worked hard to get where we've gone, right? And you kind of lift your head up and you wake up and you're like, this is hard work, and there's no one. I'm doing it in some cases alone. So in that sense, we're kind of activated or awakened to really do something different. And for me, I see a clarity in social justice, racial justice, injustice, dealing with this. And the way we're going to have to deal with it, in my mind, is bringing the right voices to the table. There's a power not only in storytelling, but there's a power in partnerships, and the right partnerships. And some of the people who have been speaking the most, whether they be those who have much more of the wealth in this country, they need to take a step back and allow the voices from the community, or some of the individuals who come from these communities who are interested in the health and the well-being and the growth and the racial justice and social justice of these communities, to start noodling over the right things to do. Right? No one has the right answer. And in fact, the answer is a mix of so many different things because of all the different parts and people who we are, right? And so for me, there's an excitement to have conversations with individuals to find out, well, here's the STEM pipeline. It's something I've been very interested in my science, but then there's individuals discussing things about empathy and compassion and social justice. And the Venn diagram, where's our overlap? Can we do something different? I think it's going to require a lot of resources, of course, but even more so is fostering a sense of, I could say urgency, but more so, we have to innovate from wherever we are now, whatever is being done now, we have to just assume that it's not enough because it's not moving the needle. It's not affecting the change that we would like to see. It's not allowing, I mean, even as I mentioned, a high profile, very successful Black and brown scientists, at the end of the day, they go home and they're still tired and they still feel alone and they don't have that sense of belonging because they're not impacting some of the communities that they would see to be involved in this. So how do we change that? That's a big problem, and it's a lot of people that have to be at that table.
Let me criticize you a bit.
Yeah.
Criticize you a bit. So my criticism of you would be, Gentry, you're a scientist and you trained hard to be a scientist. You went to Harvard, you did the work, you have a lab. You sound a little bit like a social worker. You sound a little bit like you're proselytizing. You sound like you're attempting to bring a humanity to science that really has no value to your scientific research. And so if I was to criticize you, let's say I was in the lab next to you, I said, Gentry, all this is a distraction from science of your work. Well, how would you respond to that?
Wow. Well, you would be like the 30th person in line that has said something of that sort to me, right? Like, okay, Gentry, thank you for the work that you've done. We'd like you to get back in your lab and be that thick-skinned individual that can persist and be the person. I mean, you know, it's very, you know, I get a little personal for me and I don't want to sound judgmental, but at the same time,
it offends
you have to call it what it is. And
it offends you. Do you find it? Does it offend
me?
Does it offend you? Yeah.
Well, probably before I would be like, well, that's an offense that I've learned to deal with, right? But now I don't see that the same way because this world, and when you talk about what's happening with COVID, the isolation of humans, the enhanced marginalization of humans, including and in particular underserved Black and brown marginalized individuals. At some point you say, you look at what you've done and you say, well, my goal is just to produce paper after paper. My interest in living, my interest in doing science is to spread the interest and the joy that I have for doing that. Maybe it'll help solve disease, right? But I'm a part of I'm contributing to it, right? I don't need a Nobel Prize. If I've contributed to the work and someone else gets a Nobel Prize down the line because of something that I've done, even in small part, I'm happy to just be a part of the whole collective, right? A lot of people look towards what is my valuation as I stand as a single individual. I look at how I can impact other lives because I know that is a true legacy as opposed to just, you know, kind of this personal viewpoint.
Let me ask you something. Are you redefining science, or should this have always been the definition of science, right? I mean, go ahead, yeah.
No, I'll finish your comment if you.
Yeah, because science has always been this thing where it always seemed and it has always been presented as something separate from reality. There's all these social issues happening out here, and as a scientist, I don't have time to really be bothered by that. In fact, it's an infringement on my work as a scientist. And what I'm hearing you saying is, no, this is very much inclusive in how we would define scientific work. So I'm asking, are you redefining science, or should this have always been the definition of science?
Well, I can't take any credit for redefining it. I would say that this is always, I mean, to some degree you could say, well, the definition should be looked at this way, but it's always been there. It's always something that should have involved everyone from all walks of life. It should also be, science should be driving innovation in social change, social justice and change, where, you know, health disparities are eliminated across the board. Access to great pathways in STEM should be available across the board. Science, the people doing it from the teachers all up to the directors of national institutes of health, should all be thinking of this as a contribution to the collective of our, of our humanity, of our community, right? And so, I think of science as a vacuum, or science is solely to do something for some pure thing. We know it can be hijacked. Clearly, that's what we've seen over the years. It can be hijacked to benefit one group over another. And I think we have to recognize that. And I think science is at a place right now, when you think of what's happening in the news and with the politicizing of this pandemic right now, science is, again, I said, is on the ropes. It's on the ropes where science is trying to hold up where we want to come out of this and still have the faith of the people, but we have to be for the people, right? We have to define that the work that we do, the people we have involved doing this work as scientists, is diverse. It's and it should be something involved in social change. It definitely can be. Again, if Black Lives Matter, then we need, for instance, more Black doctors. The STEM pipeline gets you to more Black doctors, for instance, right? And I know that's where I'm sitting. It's just kind of obvious for me. And again, I can sit in the room and talk to a group of diverse people from all walks of life. I've, interacted with many different types of people. I am unwilling to not have my true voice heard. And I don't want to speak loud in the room, louder and louder, and not be heard, right? At some point, I have to innovate and create a different way. And that may be speaking to, in this case, maybe a different group of people. What if you brought social justice and empathy and to the table at a high level when you start thinking about STEM access and pathways? What if you think of it as a public health issue or a social justice issue? It changes the landscape and allows you to step out of the room of prescriptive, institutionalized, bureaucratic, decades, into a new, fresh space where everyone can contribute, right?
It's so interesting listening to you, because what I was awakened to as you were speaking, that I was brought up believing that the way science is innovative is the old guy in the room at 3 a.m. with a candle flickering, and his eyesight is deteriorating, and he's got the quill pen, the felt pen, whatever it is, in his hand, writing on papers, and papers all over the floor, and there's no one around him. Right, it's him in this room at 3 a.m. with a long robe, maybe drinking a wine or a red wine and spilling it on the papers and keep going. And what you're doing is you are, for me, reimagining a completely different construct.
I like that, reimagining.
Inclusive, but not detrimental to the work of science. In fact, it enhances the work of science, right? Nothing is lost and everything is gained. And when you talk about the room being bigger and broadening, there's something about that, because I'm thinking, if I'm a scientist, I want as much information as possible in order to bring a solution to the scientific work I'm doing. Yes. Right? So if I want as much information as possible in order to solve this problem, why wouldn't I want a more expansive space in which to do it, which means the inclusive aspect of other people, right? Of other voices and other perceptions and that kind of thing. And yet I've landed on the reality that, or the myth and the romanticization of the single guy sitting there at 3 a.m. There's something romantic about this guy with the long gray hair. He's got the pen, the ink is spilled, and we romanticize that soul genius, right? And what you're saying is there's a limitation to that. That can no longer be the model through which we look at science, That is
definitely, I can't even call it antiquated. I would call it wrong. I would call it not, if in my reimagining, I see labs full of young people, young minds with curiosity and interest, not beaten down by the system, and willing to go do the hard work that is required to answer the questions that are needed to solve human health issues, public health issues, social justice issues. And science, that's what I see, like teams of individuals, not the solo individual at 3 a.m, right? And so something that came to me when you were speaking there also was the idea of intersectionality. You know,
I missed that. I lost your voice. Say that again.
The idea of intersectionality. I'm a scientist, but I'm a Black scientist, and I'm a Black scientist who grew up in South Central to mother of 16 when she had me, with very little. I'm also a Black scientist who likes getting up every day and doing science. But I also have other parts of me, which is an interest in seeing, you know, my community the foundation of change kind of spill into my community also, where health and educational pathways become better. And science should not be defined by one group or antiquated, where it's never evolving and, you know, people come and kind of join in or don't. It should be, you know, reciprocal. I want science to also understand who I am and why I exist. And if we begin to even bring that to the table with a level of empathy, I think we will actually solve human health issues faster with that mindset, as opposed to lack of representation of Black and brown in higher ed, in science, at all different levels, from government to biotech to the STEM industry, to even at teachers and doctors and nurses. We need that inclusivity, and the pathways and answers, you know, the secret sauce of getting us there to actually solve these problems. Yeah.
You know, as you were speaking of empathy, we're not too far from the Salk Institute, you and I, where we could probably throw a rock and hit the Salk Institute.
Right.
And when you talk about the intersectionality between science and empathy, I think of Jonas Salk giving away, right? The polio vaccine, and just, I mean, it was just, this is my contribution to humankind, and I'm not interested in cashing in on it. And, you know, and that intersectionality between compassion, empathy, and science is what transforms the world. I mean, he changed the life of the world permanently. Yep,
absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
What's next? Go ahead, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just, you know, this is a special time, I think. This is a special time.
There seems to be a deep reflection within you, and that reflection doesn't seem divorced from science, right? It seems like there is a profound reflection within you. And what is that? If you can articulate that, what is that? What is that? What is that intersection within you in terms of science and empathy? That's really, it's alive within you. I could feel.
Well, I think when we started, right, you asked me about science, and I was like a kid in a candy store, right? I love thinking about the science that I do, the scientific questions, where we're going, the involvement of the graduate students and postdocs and undergrads in my labs, the contribution that we can make, but just the mere doing it and feeling included. And on the same page is my interest in social justice and diversity. And for me, it's like they sit there. Most of the times, academic excellence and diversity are two separate things. And even if they're meant to be on the same page, they wind up very far away in the book of instructions on how we are supposed to advance science and access for all. But if we put them on the same page, if we start to value them together in a real way, I think for me, I've been sitting in that space for quite a long time. It's tough because it's a balancing act, right? But there are some who are doing it, but I realize now I don't have to do it alone. I don't louder than anyone in the room to be heard, to make, I can find the right community that wants to, for instance, be the right partner for me to make the right changes in time and space, say in the community right now, right here, for instance.
What would you like your 85-year-old self to say to you? Your 85-year-old, you're sitting in a rocking chair. Let's say you're still in San Diego. Hopefully you are, because I enjoy hanging out with you. But you're 85 years old, you're in the rocking chair. I'm sitting next to you, maybe. We have a couple of cigars. What would give you peace? What would you want your 85-year-old self to say to you?
I think it would be enjoy the quiet. Enjoy the quiet, Gentry. You've worked hard, and that may be a little esoteric, but for me, I've had a balancing act of wanting to do this with such a passion and not necessarily knowing where the troops on the side are behind me. You know, am I going into this alone? You know, but knowing that that I put up a good fight, and now I can just sit and watch the young folks contribute. And I will, if I'm alive at 85, I'll probably still be pushing, trying to do more and more, you know. But I hope that I'll find a little bit of quiet and calmness, and knowing that, you know, the work that I've done has mattered, not just to me and not just to the marbles that I count and they're in my jar of marbles and of my life, but I see that there was a community that began to understand the language that I was speaking. And I didn't have to say it too loud. I could speak, and we all begin to understand each other, and sit and enjoy. Sit and enjoy. You're still in San Diego. Sit and enjoy, man.
Yeah. How are things in the lab? How is your scientific research going?
We're doing good. We are, you know, you're always pushing for the next grant or for the next paper.
Yeah.
But we're excited about before I got on with you here in this conversation, I was speaking directly about the next project in addition to a project that we're doing. And so I'm flipping back and forth between, you know, talking about important aspects of what we're talking about here, the storytelling that we're doing, but also just the sheer science, right? And so my lab is, they've come a long way with me in my evolution throughout the last 4 or 5 years of doing this work. Luckily, my PATHS program has a full staff, so I can step away and I don't have to worry about that. And I have a better balancing act of the science that I'm doing day to day in my lab and the work outside of my lab in the realm of social justice, right? That's tough. A lot of people, as you said, might say, Gentry, why are you doing this? It's too tough, man. And I would say, well, I don't know anything else to do. This is what I feel. This is what I want to do. And this is the contribution that I can make, right? Yeah.
What's the one word that's sitting with you right now?
I would say, this, not to be too cliche, I would say hope, right? You know, I would say I am definitely hopeful, not only within my renewed kind of passion and understanding and vantage point for what needs to take place and the science that I'm doing, right? But the hope that we all can kind of begin to speak the same language and see the same space and be okay with being in that space together to answer the big questions that we need to answer. And so, yeah, it's I feel very hopeful. I also have a level of calm that I feel is needed to take on this type of work. There's a reason why you may have heard of the term a race or a black tax, right? Black scientists, we do so much. We have to push. A lot of times people don't think that we deserve to be in those spaces, right? As we rise up the ranks. And I'm okay with talking about that. And, I'm okay with knowing that that system was not built for me to persist and exist and do well. And then it's okay to call it out and want to correct it because I care about it, right? Just like I care about my community, I care about the system. But I know that if we found a common place and like a meeting of the minds, it could do so much. It's almost like I have the answer to a secret that I'm still trying to understand, and I'm just trying to make sure that the players, the people at the table, can begin to decipher the code and understand what that is, right? And I think it's a part of just the effort that we bring, the passion that we bring, the empathy that we bring to solve these questions and these problems, right?
Professor Gentry, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your curiosity, and I think the invitation to really look at how we approach science in a way that's inclusive, not just for the necessity of science, but for the benefit to everyone. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure hanging out with you.
All right. Take care.